speaking today in our research seminar on ancient philosophy and its reception. And he's going to talk about what is the project of Metaphysics Alpha Elaton. So, Christian, thanks a lot. You have roughly 50 minutes or 1 hour if it is necessary. You just tell me. And you're going to share your screen, right?
Yes. So can everyone see my handout? Okay, perfect. Yeah, well, first, thank you so much, Edgar, for the invitation, and also Ricardo. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Also, I mean, unfortunately, it's only virtual, but I hope that we, see each other in person at some point too. And yeah, as already announced, my talk today is about little alpha. And yeah, 50 minutes should be okay. So let's begin. So roughly, there are 4 options about how to take alpha Elaton. So first, it could be an introduction to metaphysics, or it could be a part of the metaphysics. I mean, these are distinct options, and not everyone agrees. So you might think it's actually the second book of the metaphysics as we have it, or it could have been an introduction to a metaphysical project that Aristotle never carried through. It could be an introduction to theoretical philosophy as a whole, or to a project where Aristotle had not yet adequately distinguished between metaphysics and physics. 3, it could be that it's just a collection of 3 unconnected chapters. So again, Alpha Elaton 1 might be a proem to a theoretical philosophy or metaphysics. Alpha 2 is some sort of reflection about the 4 causes, and Alpha Elaton 3 is an introduction to physics. So we have 3 options. Or 4, it's actually a unified introduction to physics. And in my footnote, and I guess the handout will also be sent to you, you see some representatives of this, of the respective views. And what I want to convince you of today is that 4 is actually correct, and Alpha Elaton is a unified introduction to physics. And so there are 4 claims in particular that I want you to believe. First is Alpha Elaton is not an introduction to any science in the first chapter, but it describes an epistemic ideal as part of a general paideia of the theoretical sciences. Alpha Elaton 2 just defends this epistemic ideal. Alpha Elaton 3 then reminds us that a physical study has norms and standards distinct from other sciences. And Alpha 3 then also gives us the topic of what follows. And the plan of my talk is as follows. So first, I'm going to argue that Alpha Elaton 3 must be understood as an introduction to physics. This is my first goalpost, so to speak. Then I will introduce the distinction between the method and the content of a science. And then finally, show how this distinction allows for a unified reading of Alpha Elaton as a whole. So let's begin with section. Someone has their microphone on. Okay, so section 1, the topic announced. So that's my text 1 from Alpha Elaton 3. Mathematical accuracy is not to be demanded in all cases, but only in things that do not have matter. For this reason, its method is not that of natural science, but presumably all nature has matter. Hence, one must inquire first what nature is, for in this way, it will also be clear what natural science is about. And then there's a part that it's excised, and I accept this. But we can come back to it in the Q&A if you are interested in the reasons. and whether it belongs to one science or more to investigate the causes and the principles of things. So there are two ways to take the proton in this quote. They are already mentioned by Alexander, these two ways. Proton can just indicate that, well, we must first define nature in order to begin the inquiry about nature. So it's basically the first thing we have to do. An alternative that Alexander mentions is that it distinguishes the present treatise from what first must be done in physics. So basically, we're interested, let's say, in metaphysics, and what you have to do in physics first is define nature, but since we're not doing physics, we're not going to do this. And I must say that I find the second option quite forced. For Dio skeption proton does not express a sort of, I think it's called unreal conditional in English, but it sets an agenda. In fact, I did a little TLG search. It occurs about 18 times in Aristotle, skeption proton. And it always gives you what he is gonna do next, either immediately or a bit later, but it always sets the agenda of something that he's presently doing. He's not saying, well, in some cases you could do this next. So I take it the straightforward way to read this is this sentence introduces a physical study. Now, I should also add that defining nature is not part of this claim in Zeta 11, the first task in a metaphysical study. Now, it might be true that as a metaphysician, it helps if you have some knowledge of physics, if you, let's say, are interested in the notion of form or whatever. And so it's not that sort of physical knowledge is useless for that, but still, it's not the task of the metaphysician in any strong sense to define nature. It's a result the metaphysician can rely on, but it's not something the metaphysician herself would do. Next, I also think that this sentence pretty clearly shows that there is a distinction between metaphysics and physics at this stage. Remember, some scholars, Berti or Donini, they thought that this comes from a period in Aristotle's life in which he had not distinguished physics and metaphysics. So he had some sort of universal science, maybe from Platonist academic science in mind. But the clear distinction between things that do not have matter and things that have matter and the respective implications for the methods of the respective sciences shows to me that he had a very clear view about the specifics of physics and probably also about the specific of metaphysics, even though he only mentions mathematics here. Now, you might say, well, he only mentions mathematics and not metaphysics. Isn't that a reason to assume that he has not separated out metaphysics? Again, I don't think so, because it seems to be, let's say, specific claim that's often associated with this early phase, namely that some sort of metaphysical almost Platonic project that Aristotle had from the academy. And believing that there is sort of a science, mathematics, which deals with things that have no matter and is accurate. And then there's another thing, which is supposedly sort of the highest universal science the Platonist believes in. And its object to not allow for the greatest precision seems just implausible to me. So I take it this last sentence pretty clearly shows that we are in a genuinely physical project here. Now, we might go further, and this is a hypothesis that I think was first floated by Janone. I hope I pronounce the name correctly, in the 60s, 1960 paper. And more recently, Stephen Mann defended this view, namely that alpha Elaton 3 actually introduces physics too. So I put the end of alpha Elaton 3 together with the beginning of physics, and it reads just perfectly, i.e., hence we must inquire first what nature is, for thus we shall see also what natural science treats of, and now physics too, of things that exist. Some exist by nature, some from other causes. By nature, the animals and their parts, and so on and so forth. So I find this a very attractive hypothesis. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I'm not going to defend it. I mean, it would require an altogether different talk, but I just want to say that I'm sort of sympathetic to this idea, and I think it would also give some sort of, story about what alpha Elaton was for. And then, of course, you might think that once perhaps physics 2 was a monobiblion, then Aristotle wrote another kind of introduction with physics 1. Alpha Elaton had to go, and it ended up in the metaphysics, which is more discombobulated. And by the way, alpha Elaton 1 sounds so metaphysical. So this sort of would be a larger story. I'm not going to defend it here, but we can talk about it in the Q&A. But this is sort of something I'm sympathetic to, though I'm not. I don't have any really new arguments to add, besides sort of the arguments that were given by the scholars that I just mentioned. So let me come to my section 2. So the big obstacle for my project is sort of that, you might think, well, yeah, maybe alpha Elaton 3 introduces physics, but really alpha Elaton 1 and 2 do not fit this at all. So alpha Elaton as a whole is not a unified project. And to unify it, I rely on a distinction between being educated in the method of a science and its content. So that's my text 2. Again, alpha Elaton 3. Aristotle says, therefore, one must have been educated about how to accept each sort of argument, since it is absurd to seek simultaneously a science and the method of the science. Now, he doesn't really elaborate a lot, but there are the text where I think we get a pretty good grasp on what he means. So the method he's talking about here, and this is my translation for tropos. You might also translate something like approach or manner. I choose method. Concerns a certain knowledge of standards, horoi, for the science. And what alpha Elaton 3 is doing, it reminds us of the necessity of this pre-pedantic knowledge. So before you can approach any science, you must be educated in its specific methods. And that talk we find also, for instance, in the parts of animal. That's text 3. So it is clear that for the inquiry into nature too, there must be certain standards, such that by referring to them, one can appraise the manner of its proofs, apart from the question of what the truth is, whether thus or otherwise. Now, these standards, they will include specifics about physics. So in the Eudemian Ethics, Aristotle says, not being well educated is just the inability to discern in each subject which arguments belong to it and which are foreign to it. And if you remember my text 1, Aristotle reminded us that the objects of physics have matter, which means that the theorems of physics only hold for the most part, for instance. Parenthesis, it's clear that for Aristotle, even those things that only hold for the most part are within the realm of proper scientific knowledge. So he's not saying it's not a science. And so Kuhlmann, in his book 1974 about Wissenschaft and Methode, he writes a lot about these standards and what they imply, and also that they are a genuinely anti-Platonic project. For my purposes, another aspect of this education is more important, namely that there's also a kind of general education about the standards of inquiry and knowledge. Generally, oh yeah, that's that one. So for instance, text 4 says, further, each person judges rightly what he knows and is a good judge about that. Hence, the good judge in a given area is the person educated in that area, and the unqualifiedly good judge is the person educated in every area. And T5, which is from the Parts of Animals again, I won't read that out, but it's on the handout for later discussion, has a very similar, says something very similar. The upshot is, and this is my text, is that the generally educated person has the disposition to judge well, to judge what is well said regarding every subject matter. Thus, she knows A, what is distinctive of the individual sciences, but importantly, she will also know the standards common to all sciences. And examples of these latter standards are, for instance, the ability to distinguish between explanatory and non-explanatory syllogisms, that's from the Eudemian ethics, and knowing that they're indemonstrable truths, that's from Metaphysics, Gamma. So these general standards, or the general education, is based on the scientific theory of the analytics. And that's actually something that Aristotle said more or less explicitly in T6. So he says, concerning the attempts of some of those who speak about the truth, in which way it should be accepted, they do this because they lack education in the analytics. And I take ton analyticon here to refer to the work analytics and not to some sort of analytic method. For one must come already knowing these things, not seek them while listening to the lecture. So apparently, a general training in the analytics is a prerequisite for approaching any science, or as the present context suggests, coming to any lectures on specific sciences like physics. And again, in text 1, we had the same idea. In Alpha Aton 3, Aristotle makes clear that those who come listening to these lectures, they already must have this pre-pedagogic knowledge. So this distinction now between the content of a science and a general method that you must know before you approach any science gives me, I say, an argument for the unity of the little alpha. So alpha 1 and 2, I read as part of a general paideia outlining an epistemic ideal as it is presented in the process analytics. And alpha elaton 3, I then read as part of the specific paideia of physics. So Aristotle first makes some remarks about an epistemic ideal that underlies all sciences, what we aim for in the first 2 chapters. And in especially the second chapter, he defends it. So the possibility of knowledge as such. And in alpha 3, he turns then to specifics and say, well, there's some specific things we need to take care of. And then at the very end, he says, and now we can start what we wanted to start, i.e. a lecture on physics. So that's my argument. Now, here is one question that you might ask yourself, which is, well, could this epistemic ideal in alpha 1 and 2 not also introduce metaphysics? After all, I just said it's a general epistemic ideal underlying all sciences. And to a certain extent, I think that's true. You know, it could, or not all of it, as I will say, but some parts of it could certainly be used also to lead us into metaphysics. However, I think that the presence of alpha Elaton 3 really shifts the burden of proof. Given that he says at the end of alpha Elaton 3, we must now define nature, i.e. announce the physical project, it seems quite plausible to read the, sorry, implausible to read the general remarks in alpha Elaton 1, let's say, as about metaphysics. And to bolster this up here, two comparisons. One is take physics 1.1. So physics 1.1, I think, is a general introduction about inquiry into principles and is not restricted to physical sciences. And what he says there about the whole and the part and analyze it, that's not only true of physical science, that has a more, has a broader application. At the same time, it is perfectly well used there to sort of, you know, lay out in general this method of analysis and then come to physics specifically. Second, I think it's also noteworthy to see that how Aristotle actually introduces the metaphysics or his metaphysical project in the big alpha 1 and 2. So there Aristotle says that wisdom is, and I think that's well known, is scientific knowledge of first principle and causes. And he says this wisdom is universal, most exact, teachable, pursued for its own sake. It's about the primary things that are most scientifically knowable, it's most ruling. So he lists all these features. Now it's pretty clear that from metaphysics alpha Mason 1 and 2, you walk away with the impression, oh, there's a very specific metaphysical project here. And Aristotle mentions what is specific about metaphysics. And none of this is present in the little alpha. So there is simply no indication that he has metaphysics specifically in mind. And given that alpha Elaton 3, we are talking about physics, I think it's implausible to think, well, just because you could use some material to introduce it to metaphysics, it's about metaphysics. Okay. So I have said alpha Elaton 3 leads us to physics. And I introduced this distinction between the tropos, the method of a science, and its content. And what I was arguing was that alpha Elaton 1 and 2 basically lay out this general method that comes from the analytic as part of an epistemic ideal about what knowledge truly is. And now, of course, in the rest of my talk, which is in a way the big obstacle, is showing that alpha Elaton 1 and 2 actually fit this framework. So let's start with T7. I'm not going to read it out because I think this passage, I mean, it's the beginning where he speaks about the study of truth and how it's hard and easy and has this nice comparison to the bats that don't see in light. And I mean, it's full of sort of well-crafted allusion to some Platonic themes and the common effort of humanity. But I think here, no one would say this is specifically about metaphysics, so I'll give it short shrift. What I want to say, though, is that this passage is reasonably taken to describe an epistemic ideal in the following sense. It describes what it is or what the condition is in which the knower completely knows some X. And basically sets our epistemic goal, i.e. making what is intelligible by nature intelligible to us. So what is most intelligible in nature are the ultimate causes in each domain, and grasping them, one can give a scientific demonstration of effect. So, and this is sort of, that in a more bombastic manner than I did here, but I would say that's more or less the upshot. Now things get more interesting in what follows, beginning with T8 and T9, and that is sort of the part where those who see metaphysics at the forefront point to. Okay, so T8. It is certainly right to call philosophy the knowledge of truth. Now, we do not know the true without its cause. So again, I take it the second sentence here, and I cut something out. I will come back to them. Just is this epistemic ideal from Post-Analytics 1.2. To know X, one must know it through its causes. This is sort of what knowledge is, scientific knowledge. It's causal knowledge. And we get this funky expression, ten philosophian epistemen tes aletheas. It's the only occurrence of that specific phrase in the corpus. But philosophy, philosophian, typically refers to the three main theoretical disciplines: mathematics, physics, and metaphysics. For instance, you find it in Epsilon 1, and for metaphysics, it has famously Brote added, so it's the first philosophy. So on the face of it, philosophia is just an umbrella term for all, and all of the theoretical sciences share a certain, let's say, common goal, i.e., they want to know things through its causes, and they want to know what's true. And true here, I take to be ontological truth, i.e., more or less what is the case. So it's just sort of the most general description about what you do in theoretical sciences. You are concerned with truth, necessary eternal truth. This is how he continues, text 9. And each thing has the attribute to the highest degree compared to other things, if in virtue of it, the synonymous attribute also belongs to the other things. For example, fire is the hottest, for it is the cause of heat for all other things. Therefore, that which is the cause of being true for posterior things is most true. This is why the principles of eternal things must be most true, for they are not sometimes true, nor is there any cause of being for them, but they are the cause of being for other things. Hence, as each thing stands in respect to being, so it stands in respect to truth. So, as you might have guessed, I think that this just explicates the general claim that knowledge of X comes through its causes further. But one might wonder, this synonymy principle and degrees of truth, that's very strange. Now, my colleague in Toronto, Lloyd Gerson, for instance, thinks that this points to an early project in Aristotle's metaphysical thinking, because he has the idea that there is a highest metaphysical cause, which sort of works as a synonymous cause with everything else, which is, as we know, something he gave up later, because being is not synonymous, but is a proshen homonym. So there are many ways you could go here. The other thing is that he speaks about the principles of eternal things. Again, you might think eternal things, principles of them. That's certainly metaphysics. And on the whole, this passage sounds a bit like some sort of almost Platonic metaphysics. But I want to convince you otherwise. And to do this, I want to go back to the definition of the knower in Post-Analytics 1.2. So here Aristotle, I mean, there's a very famous passage that we think we know a thing simpliciter and not in a sophistic fashion, accidentally. Whenever we think we are aware both that the explanation because of which the object is its explanation and that it's not possible for this to be otherwise. And then he says, well, there might also be another kind of knowledge that identified with news. If then knowing is as we posited, it is necessary for demonstrative understanding, in particular, to depend on things which are true and primitive and immediate and more familiar than and prior to and explanatory of the conclusion. For in this way, the principles will also be appropriate to what is being proved. For there will be deduction even without these conditions, but there will not be demonstration, for it will not produce knowing or understanding. So I take it that what we find in Alpha Elaton 1 really goes back to this epistemic ideal, as I called it. Note that in a way it shared the same themes, certainly, than Alpha Elaton 1 and what we have read so far in text 7 through 9. To know X, one must grasp the causes of X. As X causes, the causes are more explanatory, they are more familiar, they are more intelligible, and so on and so forth. And indeed, in the very same chapter in the Post-Analytics, Aristotle also uses the synonymy principle. That's text 11. He says, for a thing always belongs better to that thing because of which it belongs. So that's the synonymy principle stated. For instance, that because of which we love is better loved. Hence, we know and are convinced because of the primitives. We both know and are convinced of them better, since it is because of them that we know and are convinced of what is posterior. So the grades of knowledge depend, and I'm assuming that he is actually grading knowledge and not just conviction, but it does not matter so much for my present argument, depend on the explanatory relations of priority and posteriority as set out in text 10. So we see that the synonymy principle is applied to this epistemic ideal from the analytics, and I take it that Aristotle just recalls it in sort of a shorthand when he speaks about synonymy here in Alpha Elaton 1. Now you might say, well, Alpha Elaton 1 speaks specifically about degrees of truth and not just degrees of being more explanatory or intelligibility. And that's something that is missing from the analytics. But again, there is a passage which is a bit hard. So, I mean, I would be interested to hear how you take this passage. Which is text 12, it's from the prior analytics 127. So the context is sort of how to find appropriate premises for a demonstration and deduction. And then Aristotle said, the terms which follow the subject must also be divided into those which are predicated of it essentially, those which are peculiar to it, and those which are predicated incidentally. And these again should be divided into such as are matters of opinion and such as are according to the truth. For to the extent that someone is supplied with more of these, he will more quickly hit on a conclusion. But to the extent that he is supplied with more true things, the more will he demonstrate. So here we find also something like degrees of truth. There are some things that are aletheron than other things. How to understand this talk about things that are more true? Well, I would say that degrees of truth are grounded in the order of knowledge and demonstration. So X is truer than Y because in this order, X is prior to Y. So he's not talking about degrees of propositional truth. Aristotle does not say there are things that are half true, almost true, nearly true. He is saying that some things are truer than others because certain truths explain other truths. I take it there are good indications for that. So here, for instance, Posiantics 127. So I take it essential predication and the predication of a property are both true. So it's not that one of them is not really true. So it's not degrees of or grades of propositional truth he's talking about here. Instead, he says that demonstration based on essential predicates are more explanatory and better than those based on properties. So if you see the last sentence, so if I'm supplied with more true things, the better I will demonstrate, I take to mean, well, there are some truths which are more fundamental than others, and grasping these more fundamental truths helps me in my demonstration. The same holds of alpha elaton 1, the text 9. So the direction of explanation is if X is the truth, is the cause of truth to Y, X is truer than Y. So he's not saying there are degrees of truth, and because some things are truer than others, these things that are more true cause other things. Instead, he goes the other way around, i.e., he goes from an, let's say, like antecedently available order of causation, explanatory priority, and uses it to introduce degrees of truth. So degrees of truth here are just grounded in the fact that some things are causes to other things. Second, I already mentioned that I take the talk of truth here to mean ontological truth, which is a feature of the object. And as many people have noted, ontological truth is intimately tied to intelligibility. So again, this leads us to this idea that the principles of a science are most true because they are the most intelligible. So to wrap this up, I say that T9 just concerns this epistemic ideal from the analytics. The synonymy principle and degrees of truth in alpha elaton come directly from this ideal because the principles are truer, i.e. they are more explanatory and intelligible because they are the causes of truth to other things. Small parenthesis, I haven't really told you what degrees of truth are. I just said they are grounded in this order of explanation. And there are two ways to take it. And I took these from an article by Donald Morrison. So you might think there's a, let's call it the ordering interpretation. In that, according to this interpretation, X is truer than Y just is another way of saying that X is prior to Y. But you might also think that there is, let's call it the intensity interpretation, is that X is truer than Y expresses that X is true to a higher degree, like some things are bluer than others. And the difference is that on the intensity interpretation, going from X is prior to Y to X is truer than Y is a real inference. Aristotle does not make this explicit. You could take it either way. For my purposes, it doesn't matter a lot. For independent, let's say, interest, it matters. And of course, it's intimately related to this discussion about degrees of being. But I won't go into this now. Similarly, the other, let's say, evidence for metaphysical reading, namely that the principles of things that are always, this phrase, I don't think is decisive because all scientific knowledge is about what is eternal. And this is what you find in text 13 and text 14. Text 13, if text 13 said that, that would be great, because that is the thing that I cut out in the quote above. Oh no, that's not one. Alpha elaton 1. However, the idiom there's another way, or there's another phrase transmitted by the alpha family. So it's textually a bit tricky. But even if we set T13 aside, we can come back to it in the discussion. Text 14 is pretty clear that epsilon1, where he says all causes are eternal, but especially these, i.e. the causes that are the object of first philosophy. So just because he speaks of principles of things that are eternal doesn't mean he's now talking about metaphysical principles. They are all eternal. I mean, this is what sciences are about. It's also something you find in the Nicomachean Ethics, book 6. Indeed, one might even, turn it around and say, if Aristotle wants to single out the specific metaphysical causes, as he does in epsilon1, he actually emphasizes their special standing. And again, we find no such emphasis in the little alpha. Now that the principles are most true is, I take it, a direct consequence of the epistemic ideal, which hinges on the existence of ultimately first cause. Right. So the superlatives are basically what we also find in post-analytics 1, 2. They gotta come to an end. There must be highest causes from which, or highest principles from which we demonstrate. And this also is what he will do in alpha 2. So to conclude this section, alpha 1 describes an epistemic ideal as part of a general paideia of all theoretical science. That's was my argument. And I think I hope I could make plausible that it fits this ideal, the text as we find it. Now, alpha elaton 2, as I said, picks up on this, namely, alpha elaton 1 said, well, complete knowledge of X is knowledge of X causes. So alpha elaton 2 has to prove that the causes are not infinite. Otherwise, knowledge would be impossible and everything would go down the drain. Now, again, you find sometimes in the literature when people want to defend it, say, well, of course, it's important for metaphysics that the causes are not infinite. So clearly Aristotle, in the big alpha, he talked about the 4 causes. Now, little alpha, he says, well, these causes are infinite. That makes perfect sense. But I think this argument is a bit too quick because that's only true on a very general level. Because I actually think that discussion of the metaphysically first cause does not motivate a discussion that all causes are not infinite. And I think this can be seen in several ways. One is the possibility of mathematics or physics does not depend on the existence of a metaphysically first principle. It only depends on the first principle in the respective sciences. And I think it's a kind of a mistake to think that the basic cosmology items that explain a biological fact are the highest metaphysical causes. So for instance, the basic material cause of X is not the highest metaphysical cause that wisdom is about. Moreover, Aristotle emphasizes that its sciences are independent. So I mean, there's some kind crossing is allowed. Sometimes there can be some sort of overlap, but as a general rule, these are independent enterprise. So I don't think this sort of would lead you necessarily to metaphysics. I mean, of course, there should be a first metaphysical cause, but you would not have to go through all 4 causes. And also, the emphasis really seems about the causes of the thing and complete understanding. And that's another thing. metaphysical knowledge of being qua being does not deliver knowledge of any x qua x, or the first principle of x qua x are not the principles of being qua being. I mean, metaphysics is universal, that's for sure, but it does not mean that therefore the metaphysician is a kind of polymath that knows everything. Whatever the universality is grounded in, it seems to be in not in the sense that of the metaphysician is also the expert physicist. Therefore, I take it that showing that all chains of causes are finite shows that scientific knowledge is possible, but not that metaphysics is possible. It might actually be that no chain ends in a separately existing cause. You know, it has to end somewhere, these causes, but doesn't mean that the causes in which it ends is a separately existing prior cause as the one metaphysics deals with. So you might think that alpha Elaton 2 is successful without there being any metaphysics. So as I said, I think this explains better some features of alpha Elaton 2. I mean, the discussion is a bit confusing sometimes, but he discusses upward and downward chains or four causes. And I think this just fits much better with a general project about the possibility of knowledge than a project about the possibility of metaphysics. So slowly wrapping up, let me come to two objections that have been raised or could be raised against my account. One is this proof in alpha Elaton 2 that the four causes are exhaustive and not infinitely serious should not be part of the method, as I say it is, but the content of physics. So you find this in print in the article by Thomas Slezak in the volume Zweifelhaftes. So you might think it's just implausible that alpha Elaton 2 is part of a general methodological reflection and not part of the content of physics. And more specifically, you might think, well, if this hypothesis or suggestion that I gave above, namely that it introduces physics 2, makes things worse, because why would he introduce the four causes in physics 2, 3, and 7 when they have already been discussed in alpha 2 at length? And my answer is twofold. One is, well, Osteoanalytics 2.11 clarifies that all sciences prove their theorems through the four causes, insofar as they are applicable. I mean, I'm not saying that in all sciences you find all four causes. It's clear that you don't. Mathematics, for instance, doesn't have all four causes, but insofar as they are applicable, you always use all of them. And so they are not restricted to physics. Moreover, I think they also, plausibly, you might think that the four causes do not all originate primarily within physics. For instance, the formal cause, you might think, well, this in some way is related to Socrates' TSD question. He asked about ethics. So it seems to have a different role. And I think taking this on board actually also gives or makes good sense for physics 2, 3, and 7. And I'm relying here on an article by Malcolm Schofield on exploratory projects in physics 2, 3, and 7. Namely, part of the task of what physics 2, 3, and 7 are doing is actually showing that the four causes can be applied in physical science. I think he calls this a coup de theater. So, you know, it's a kind of coup to show that all four causes are present in physics. Now, if this hypothesis is correct, it would fit very well with this view that's up in Alpha Elaton 2. It talks about all four causes, and nota bene, he uses examples from ethics when he talks about the final cause, and shows that none of them goes ad infinitum. And then in 2, 3, and 7, he shows that they are applicable within physics. Therefore, proving that the causes are infinite, neither in kind nor series, is part of the meta theory of science or the method of science, the general paideia, and not the business of any science in particular. Okay, sorry, I still have 1 minute. So let me conclude. So I've argued that Alpha Elaton is an introduction to physics, and Alpha Elaton 3 must be read as introducing physics. Given that, the question is, how can we read it as a unified logos? And by all appearances, it seems more likely that these are not just 3 chapters jumbled together. And I've been arguing that the notion of paideia connects the chapters of Alpha 1 and 2, part of a general paideia, Alpha 3, part of a specific paideia. And finally, I have floated the hypothesis, though the main defenders are not present, that Alpha might have been an introduction to not a project like Physics 2, but actually Physics 2 as we have it. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Christian. Yes, this was a wonderful talk. I'm sure that there are going to be questions, so please raise your hand.
Maybe I stop sharing because I think people now will have a handout, and then I see better.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Some familiar faces.
Yeah, Ricardo.
Thank you, Edgar. Well, thank you very much, Christian, for this very good talk. I enjoyed it very much. But I have a couple of questions about about some of your claims in the argument. One, so your general strategy, in very general terms, is to show that Alpha 3 is specifically about physics, and that even though Alpha Elaton 1 and Alpha Elaton 2 are not necessarily about physics only, they complement Alpha 3 because they also, they state general methodological principles that are valid for any science, including physics. So Alpha 1 and Alpha 2, Alpha Elaton 1 and Alpha Elaton 2, even though they are not restricted to physics, they are useful for physics. Is that correct? Is that the general?
Yes. That's more or less the general outline.
Exactly. Very generally. Yeah. Okay. Now, so my first question has to do with the claim that Alpha Elaton 3 is about physics only. What's your evidence for this? Is your evidence that in Alpha Elaton 3, Aristotle says that he will investigate physics?
Yes.
And the claim that you make, that when Aristotle says that he's going to investigate physics, he is introducing natural science.
Yeah, I mean, he's so my main witness is hence one must first inquire what nature is, for in this way it will also be clear what natural science is about.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
And
yeah, I mean that's strong evidence, of course, because okay, but however, you yes, but you say at some point something that is stronger, which is that defining nature. I mean the second page of your handout. The defining nature is not passe zeta 11, the first task in a metaphysical study. Well, I'm not sure. I don't remember this passage that you cite here from zeta 11, but I'm not sure if defining nature is not an important task in a metaphysical study. I'm not sure about this because in Aristotle's metaphysics, in Zeta, no, as a whole, he studies sensible substance, no, and by sensible substance he means natural substance, I think, because there is a whole discussion about whether Aristotle would include artifacts, or whether he would regard artifacts as substances at all. So when he discusses sensible substance in Zeta, he seems to be concerned with natural substances. But I mean, if your explanandum, if your object of study is natural substance, then physis is relevant for your inquiry somehow, no? Because you have to narrow down. I mean, you have to define what natural substance is, and to do that, you need the concept of physis. But it's true that in Zeta he doesn't define physis, no? Or does he? I don't think he does. But I mean, in general terms, if you want to embark in a metaphysical study such as the one proposed by Aristotle in Metaphysics, I think that the definition of physis is relevant. No, I mean, is relevant. Well, somehow, but so that's one question I have. No, I mean, is it really true that defining nature is not is not an important task in a metaphysical study? So that's my first question, and if you want, I can ask the second one after.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, so the Zeta 11 passage is where Aristotle says, well, in a way, what we are doing here would be the task of the physicist and not of the metaphysician. So he's talking about perceptible substances and matter and form. However, there were certain, I think he said something like a usefulness or the way I would see it, I mean, and I hope this is not the move of obscurum per obscurius explanation, is that I'm not denying, and I mean, Aristotle says it has a certain usefulness for metaphysics, but he makes no attempt to define physics specifically and say what physics is about. I mean, that just goes much better with thinking he's actually interested in physics. Second, the way I'm inclined to read Zeta Eta is actually not as a sort of proper metaphysical study, but rather as something that might help us getting to metaphysics. And I think this also explains why he sort of relies on certain physical theorems in a sort of very like the form matter distinction and so on, in a let's say, general way. But metaphysics as such, what he's really interested in metaphysics, I take it, is sort of the highest cause. And it's supposed to study of being qua being. And in that sense, it seems to be that texts like eta, zeta, they're almost like, straddling in between the sciences. So it's a bit hard to assign a proper home to them. But nevertheless, even in these texts where he clearly relies on physical doctrines, and maybe he's interested now in their causes of perceptible substances as causes of their being, I would still think that, that's what I say, is that it's a difference between saying, well, we've defined nature properly, we know how perceptible substances are analyzed, now looking at them, we might sort of get clear about some metaphysical doctrines we're also interested about, sort of in terms of, the way to the study, as opposed to seeing us as an integral part of the study. But Alpha Elaton 3 seems to say, well, we need to get clear about what physics is. In the later books like Zeta, Eta, it seems pretty clear what physics is about. So there's no delineation necessary. So this is what I mean with that it's something the metaphysician relies on, but it's not something the metaphysician herself would be doing.
Okay, thanks. Can I ask another question, Edgar, or should I leave it for later?
I think better we leave it for later,
okay,
Ricardo, because there are more questions, and then we can come back to your question. Andre, please. Hi, Andre, how are you?
Hi, thanks. Thank you very much. So I would like to shift the question, so to speak. So Alpha Elaton doesn't belong to metaphysics as we have it. Whatever its purpose may be, somebody thought that it fitted well where it is. So what are your thoughts about the reasons why such a strange text would, attract anybody who would give some kind of supplement or whatever to the project of the metaphysic, which is very clearly defined in chapter in Alpha, in Alpha, and which follows in Beta. One remark about the crucial sentence, Dioper ufusikos, Dioskepteon proton TST effusis. First, I find the argument, the Dio, extremely weak. The reason why we should first see or inquire into physics seems to me weak, but we would need to analyze more in detail what precedes and the general strategy of the 3 chapters in order to decide that. But I'm not sure you're right about the, it may be that in Aristotle, Dioskepteon proton T announces directly what follows. But it seems, I have not the text of Theophrastus Metaphysics here. It seems to, I seem to record that at least in Theophrastus, the question precisely doesn't announce anything that is following, but sets up a program that should be implemented in some way. So it does that, of course, in an aporetical treatise, but the use of the, I suggest that the use of the formula should be explored beyond the Aristotle corpus, which implies also that Alpha minor could be from another hand. So, but the first question is the most, what intrigues me more. Yeah.
Yeah. How did it come to be in the metaphysics? Yeah. I mean, I don't have a brilliant story about that. Now, something. So, if we suppose that it was meant to connect to physics too, as I said, Janone and Stephen Mann and also Daniel de Montmoller believe. And I mean, Janone thinks it can be between physics 1 and 2. I find this kind of implausible because it seems to be an introduction. Then why is it no longer there? Well, because I take it that physics 1 replaced it. Now we have this text. Why put it there? And I mean, there are several reasons you could imagine. All, of course, a bit speculative. One is, well, on a first reading, Alpha Elaton 1 specifically, you might think talks about metaphysics. So there are some reasons to connect it to metaphysics. You know, he speaks about the most true things. So someone might have had a similar intuition than scholars ancient and today. Second, I mean, the text of the metaphysics has, as we all know, its problem. It would not have been the first book that is sort of inserted. And there is a specific story which I have not followed up, but as I mean, you indicated the question of the authenticity. Now, there is the scholion next or between the big alpha and the little alpha, telling us that this is a book by Pasicles. And there's a great article by Gudrun Wiemen-Diem, I hope I pronounce it correctly, who shows that actually it could be related either to big alpha or little alpha. So the question of authenticity is, I don't think a real one, it's authentic. However, it's interesting that this Pasicles is supposed to be, I think that the nephew of Eudemus. And then there are these stories that, you know, the metaphysics was kept by Eudemus, and they might have done some editing work. So maybe there's some sort of story that, you know, Eudemus did something, or his school did something to the metaphysics. And what we find here in the scholion is a sort of reflection of the fact that they might have edited a bit and put metaphysics Alpha Elaton there, because, I mean, for all its problem of internal unity, the physics seems to be more unified than the metaphysics. And given that you might think Alpha Elaton 1 talks about metaphysics, this might have been a natural place. And so this is where I am presently.
Well, if I can add just one sentence, it seems to me that in you may be right about methodology, but it seems to me that they are. I mean, what is interesting in what the interest in is the level of approach, the pedagogical, you know, overview. How do you? So there is a kind, and the tone of the whole thing is extremely bizarre. I find if you read the beginning of Alpha of the first chapter with this question tis antura samartoi, etc., it doesn't look like Aristotle is writing really. Okay. But there are at least two things that do link Alpha to Alpha minor 1 to Alpha. It's the idea that you collect doxy. It's useful to collect doxy because science progresses by adding some minor things together, and it adds up to a whole. And there is another thing. So, in other terms, I'm not really convinced by the demonstration, but yeah.
Thank you. Can I say one thing? I mean, thank you. I mean, the tone is a bit strange, and you might be better versed in sort of diagnosing Aristotle's voice than I am. But I mean, for me, especially the beginning, I'm kind of inclined to take this as an indication that it is meant as an introduction to something. And I mean, we can deny like what exact this, we can discuss what exactly, but these rhetorical topoi, and as you say, with the simile, who will miss the doors and the bats and the common effort of mankind, these are also generic truths that might come from anywhere, that I think, well, this really is supposed to be some sort of, general leading up to some sort of investigation. And it's hard to imagine it as the second book of anything.
Thank you.
Thank you too. And I will look for Theophrastus. Thank you.
Thanks. Robert Bolton?
Yes, thank you so much, Christian. I'm very interested to learn about your work. I've been wanting to be in touch with you for a long time, and happy to see other old friends here. So here's one way to raise a question or make a suggestion. One thing, Aristotle loves to do introductions to various things. And in fact, this is going to connect to what someone said. It's actually pretty good introduction to the physics in the first chapter and throughout the first book, especially the later chapters of book one. And this doesn't seem at all a good competitor for that. I mean, it doesn't bear enough sort of power as an introduction to physics in particular, in the way the introductions to, well, the general metaphysics, the De Anima, the meteorology, all sorts of works of Aristotle do. So I find it a little hard to think that this was ever by Aristotle himself thought of as an introduction to physics. But that doesn't settle that it has nothing to do with physics. And you point out that, well, there's this final remark that brings it into play. Now, one kind of way to try to explore this further would be to ask this question that I usually think it's good to ask. What audience is Aristotle addressing here? It's pretty clear, say, in Metaphysics Alpha, he's addressing people who want to come to know what science is and how you get science. And in the beginning of the De Anima, he's addressing what people need to know about natural science and how to make progress in natural science. And there's an awful lot of stuff there about the four causes, which is way more specific and whatnot than anything you find in Metaphysics little Alpha. So what are the possibilities? Well, we know Aristotle in the Parts of Animals, in the first book, first chapter of the Parts of Animals, he distinguishes between what he calls their general paideia and specialized paideia. You referred to this. Okay, well, it seems an awful lot more like general paideia than it does like specialized paideia when you look at all the other examples of what would count as specialized paideia at the beginnings of the other works. Now, okay, you have to find some way. Andre was making suggestions about how to deal with this final remark in Little Alpha 3. But just the general feel of it seems much more toward the direction of general paideia than toward special paideia. That's the thought.
Yeah. I mean, I agree, and I mean it's interesting because depending on the view who I'm talking to, I mean in some discussions, your remark is very welcome because at least we agree it's not about metaphysics, or we seem to agree on this. Yeah, so I mean, I'm using the general paideia, and I agree that sort of alpha elaton 1 and 2 are general throughout. Alpha elaton 3, I don't think so. I mean, because there he starts by sort of very specifically connecting it with sort of the accuracy of the argument. So he's leading us to something more specific.
But it's still people who want to decide how they're going to approach any science at all have to decide about that. What level of accuracy is appropriate here? So it's certainly not specific to physics.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I mean, and maybe, I mean, the place where I would imagine it, let's say, in a complete course on Aristotle, it would be at the very beginning of all physical treatises, so to speak. So you mean you might think that there is, let's say, an overarching lecture course, and this is the start. So the general paideia, as I see it, is because this is supposed to be starting everything. I mean, when we come to the anima or the parts of animals, you know, we've already taken, let's say, physics 101, and now we can add more specifics. So I think our claims are not that far apart. If one says, well, you know, this is how you could start the whole enterprise of physical science by making exactly this very general remarks. Alexander, I think, if I remember, he toys with this idea that this is, so he has this idea first that it's theoretical science as a whole he's talking about, but I would say there's nothing like theoretical science as a whole, they're only individual theoretical sciences. But then later on, he kind of brings this together with the idea that, well, you start with physics and then you come to metaphysics, so as if it were like a progressive course in the theoretical sciences. And if that is meant, again, I would say, well, that could be the case, maybe, who knows, that this introduces, let's say, a lecture on theoretical sciences. First we do physics, later we do metaphysics, and it would be the most general introduction. So I agree with you that he is very much interested in this very general paideia. And I think, as I said, this rhetorical bombast also is meant to, you know, to announce this sort of, you know, what we do in the theoretical sciences. We are interested in truths and so on. And in that sense, it's much more general than what we find in the parts of animals. I mean, there, you know, the question he's discussing are really specific, like, you know, first the genus or the individual species. So we are not yet on this level of specificity, but I don't see a principal reason why we could not begin this project as a whole with this general paideia, and then in Alpha 3 come to, let's say, the first important observation about the project as a whole, which sort of introduces specificity, i.e., we deal with objects that have matter.
Well, I just say, remember the passage you quoted from Metaphysics and Gamma. He says, what you really need to know about to start doing this is the analytics. That's where we better start as a general introduction to science. You know, this other more rhetorical, dialectical stuff, as Andre was.
But I mean, this is something
that's not part of the real project for getting to know about science.
Yeah, but I mean, I think I mean, what he seems to suggest also in Alpha Elaton 3 is that this is something you already know when you come to this lecture. But
it's from the analytics that you get it, not from
you get
stuff.
it. Yeah, but I mean, what I'm suggesting is you just completed the, let's say, analytics course, and now you are sort of educated about sciences in general. And I briefly recall this general education. And now I'm telling you, but remember what we did not say in the analytics is the specifics. Here's the first specific thing about physics. It deals with objects that have matter. So first we must get clear what nature is. And now we're coming to a more specific project. So it could not, so what I'm saying is, you know, we've just have our analytics course, but that's already in place. So Alpha Elaton cannot introduce this because that's what we already know. So it must be leading us further. And I would say the first thing it leads us to is physics.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks. Fabian Mier.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Edgar, and hi, Christian. I hope this find you well. thank you for your interesting talk. And in your answer to Professor Bolton's question, because my worries are related or in a way anticipated by him, I think to understand much better what you mean. But at the end, my question is just for clarification about the concept of method. You mentioned at the very end of your presentation, you spoke well about general paideia and special paideia in relation to regarding to the structure of alpha minor. But my question is, to what extent, what's your concept of method when you mention, or when you put in a way at the same footing, namely general paideia or special general paideia and method? Because method seems to be something related to some specific field, method science, method of metaphysics, method of ethics, etc., etc. But this general paideia is much more general, and it is mainly based on these, as you presented, the standards of this general paideia is mainly based on namely the very general principles or principles and ideals of scientific knowledge drawn in the analytics. So the question is, why do you put on the same footing, in a way, general paideia and method at the end of your presentation?
I mean, because ultimately I believe that the paideia, let's say, or method in general has or includes both parts. So the method of a science has, let's say, a general aspect, which comes from analytics, but it also has many specifics, like specifics to, let's say, the study of animals, the specifics of mathematical studies. So this is why I think the tropos is, or what I translate as method, actually includes both. And now I grant you, and I mean that might also be partly behind Robert's question, is that Aristotle is emphasizing the specifics more than the general part. I mean, typically in his introductions, he is interested in the specifics. However, I mean, there are some passages that suggest this education includes more. And I mean, especially this idea that there's someone who is a generally educated person seems to suggest that this is someone who is does not only know the specifics of all fields, but also knows sort of generally what applies commonly across the fields. And what applies commonly across the fields, I propose, just is this epistemic ideal from the post-analytic. So this is why I bring method, or why I use method both in the general and the specific sense, because I think it has this Janus faith, you know, it's there's a general part and it's a more specific part.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
There you are. The squares are always shifting. Yeah.
Yes, Christian, I have a couple of questions related to mostly to alpha electron minor and to what has been discussed in the previous two questions. So my first question is, I mean, if you're correct about alpha minor 1 and 2, that they concern, like, some kind of methodological remarks about theoretical sciences in general.
Yeah.
It seems to me that I don't see that then we have very good reasons to think that the right interpretation of alpha minor is the one that you defend, rather than the second option that you mentioned, right? That this is just like in general, just a general introduction to theoretical sciences as a whole. I mean, because when you look at alpha minor 3, in fact, there is nothing specific about physics in reality. I mean, just the final, I mean, just the bit that you stress a lot, but all the methodological remarks there are general as well, right? About how should we investigate science, that we should first we should have had first a clear grasp on the methods and that kind of thing, right? So it seems that on the whole, alpha minor 3 has also a very general character. And if physics is mentioned, is because it's just an example that illustrates the point, right? I mean, because physics mentioned actually because he's saying that the mathematical methods should not be pursued across the board, right? That's what he seems to be most interested in showing in that chapter, right? The Platonic method, I mean, the mathematical method should not be pursued across the board. Why? Because this is only appropriate for things which have no matter. And then he says, well, that's why it is not the appropriate method of the physicos. And then it comes, and then we have because perhaps, or I don't know how you interpret the word there, ethos, perhaps, presumably, all things in physics have matter. And then it is when he says the upper, which is a bit strange. I mean, why, as Andrea was suggesting, right? It was why, from what we were discussing, how does it follow from what we were discussing, that we must investigate first what nature is? I mean, if anything, I mean, it's just in order to, I mean, based on what he said before, just in order to establish that since all things which with the physicos is concerned have matter, then the mathematical method is not appropriate, right? Or why should we investigate physics first, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I think my answer is twofold. First, now it's a bit hard to say or to spell out, or what exactly does one mean when one says it's an introduction to theoretical philosophy as a whole. Now, one view that's out there in print is that it's basically a project where Aristotle has not yet distinguished between the sciences. And he thinks there's something like a universal theoretical Platonic science. I don't think it can be this, because if it were this, he would not be able to say, by the way, physics is very special and mathematics is special and presumably metaphysics is special too. So introduce a general introduction to theoretical philosophy there is no such discipline like a general introduction to theoretical philosophy, because there's no theoretical philosophy as such. If we agree on this, then I would say, well, I mean, if we think, and there's an idealized lecture course where we do and study one theoretical science after the other, and for each we sort of mention some more specifics. So we've done physics, now we talk about metaphysics, let's do a bit of mathematics. Then I do not have a problem with that in principle. However, I would insist that if it's an introduction to such a project, then still the first thing we are doing is physics. Because, and here I would sort of, how to say, dug in. I don't think that sort of this very deflationary, it's just an example reading does justice to the end of the text. So the way I read it is not I say, oh, here's a good example. Here are things that have matter, here are things without matter, hence their method is distinct. It's more specifically that, well, because there are certain specifics about physics, we must sort of first properly define nature so we get a clear grasp on what physical science is actually about. And in the first question, I mean, Ricardo said, well, what about artifacts? And so I think there's a lot of work to be done that this text shows has not been done yet. And that is a specifically physical enterprise. So in your question, you seem to be presupposing as, well, we know everything and we just can give a nice and quick example. But the way I would read the end is, no, we actually have to properly delineate our field of study. And so in this sense, I don't think there is this deflationary reading. And coupled with the thought that, well, there is no theoretical science as a whole, and there's no period in Aristotle's life where he was not clear, or where he, or let's say, at least when he was writing Alpha Elaton, he was already clear on the distinction between these sciences. So he has not the idea of a general philosophy. Then I take it, we come very close together, because then I would say, okay, let's suppose Alpha 1 and 2 just are about, as I say, what theoretical sciences aim at. Now we know this, let's start theoretical science. We have a bit of pre-pedeutic out of the way. Let's start with our first science. What do we start with? And you say physics, then I think the differences between our interpretations are not that far away. Is that answering your question?
Okay. Thanks a lot. So you would say that then, I mean, we presuppose, and Aristotle presupposes that the mathematical method is not appropriate for physics. So that's what he presupposes, and then he said, well, then let's begin the investigation of physics, properly speaking, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. I have another question related to that point, but let's give the word to Ricardo. Thanks for your response.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, my second question was about Alpha Elaton 2. Well, in Alpha Elaton 2, we have this argument, a very interesting argument, very clear argument, important argument to show that the chain of causes cannot be infinite. Right. So I have two questions here. In the way in which you formulate your position about this chapter, you seem to suggest that this kind of inquiry is not relevant for metaphysics. But what I suppose you mean to say is that even though it is relevant for metaphysics, it can also be relevant for physics. So the fact that this argument is mentioned here doesn't necessarily imply a reference to the metaphysics or to metaphysics. It can be a reference to physical inquiry. Is that right? Or you want to say that this inquiry, that this argument is irrelevant for metaphysics? No, you don't want to say that, do you?
No. What I want to say, thinking that hopefully I can clarify it a bit, is that this argument is relevant for the possibility of scientific knowledge in general.
Yes.
And in virtue of establishing the possibility of scientific knowledge in general, it's relevant to all theoretical sciences, including physics and metaphysics. What I'm arguing against is that this is an argument designed specifically to show that there is a highest first metaphysical cause. I don't think this. It holds across the board.
Okay. Yes. So that's what I thought you wanted to say, because when you say, for example, I quote you, discussion of the metaphysically first cause does not motivate a discussion that causes are not infinite in kind of series. And but now that you've clarified, I understand your point, and I think I agree with your claim. However, I have a question about this. I would say that this argument or this project of establishing that the chains of causes are not infinite, this project is relevant for the possibility of inquiries into first principles. No, because if you're not dealing, if you're in a discipline that is not concerned with first principles at all, then why would that project be relevant for you, right? I mean,
yeah.
But you can say, of course, that physics is also concerned with first principles. But no, I mean, physics too has first principles specific to physics. I would suppose. But the only thing is that the first principles of physics are not absolutely primary, no? Because the only absolutely primary first principle would be the unmoved mover, no? I think, but what would you say about that? What would you agree that there are inquiries that are not concerned with first principles, and that in the case of these inquiries, this project of establishing that there are no infinite chains of causes is irrelevant for these disciplines that are not interested in first principles? Yeah.
Thank you. So in a way, I think that there's a certain ambiguity in speaking about first principles, because often, and I think this is what happened in Alpha Elaton 1, to diagnose a mistake by my opponents, is when Aristotle talks about something that first, people think, oh, absolutely first, metaphysically first, highest cause. But arguably, every science has its first principles. So investigating into the first principles and that they are first principles is something that is, I would say, common to all sciences, because all sciences, in a way, start from first principles. It's just that the first principles of physics and the first principle of mathematics and the first principles of metaphysics and the first principles, I don't know, of color science or whatever, are not the same first principles. And in a way, I would say there is no such science that is not, in a way, dependent on first principles. And this point about the knowledge of x qua x is, well, if my target explanation is, let's say, finding the first principles of a thing qua movable, I must be assured that, the causes that explain the being of the thing qua movable are not infinite. Otherwise, I won't ever have complete knowledge of a thing qua movable. But the principles of the thing qua movable are not the things that metaphysics is about. which is about the highest ultimate first cause. Parenthesis, yeah, the unmoved mover also makes its appearance in physics, so there's always a kind of a delineation problem at some point. But yeah, this is sort of why I think the going from I'm interested in first principles to I'm interested in metaphysics is a kind of fallacy. Of course, I'm interested in first principle in metaphysics too, but that doesn't mean that sort of the first principle of metaphysics are also the first principles of all other sciences. I think that's not the case for Aristotle.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Andre, do you have another question?
Just a suggestion that occurred to me. It seems to me that I have not studied the thing in depth, but it seems to me my impression is that Alpha Minor is a commentary on book Alpha, and a commentary especially on Alpha 3 to 9, that is especially about the doxography. First, so why? Because there is something strange about Aristotle. So two things. Aristotle in Alpha says we are going to confirm something that has been established in the physics, namely that there are four causes and not anyone else, not any another, not another, right? Not 5, not 6. Not 7, not an infinite. So that can be, you know, the second chapter that is so strikingly good, as Ricardo emphasized, could be an extension of a reflection on the number of causes, and that there is a link, a possible link between, you know, the question of the number of causes as it is stated, as it is stated in Alpha, and a further reflection, of course, about the non-infinity of causes, and then the remark about physics at the end could be it's artificial a little bit, but it is striking that that the project of Alpha presupposes the physics, so explicitly relates to the physics. So in a sense, physics is first. Okay, this is, and then you have all this thing about accumulating knowledge and so on, which is strikingly related to what Aristotle does. So why not think about, you know, somebody reflecting like Theophrastus does in the so-called metaphysical fragment about the enterprise, and wanting to illuminate or raise implicit question or explicit question for the auditors that know, you know, something about what Aristotle is doing in Metaphysics Alpha, and that relates good to the, because you have praxis, you have mathematics, you have something of epsilon 1 also here. I mean the whole picture, right? So somebody who is asking oneself about the whole construction. But the suggestion, of course, presupposes that Aristotle is not speaking that it's not Aristotle who is speaking, whether Pasicles or whoever. So,
yeah, thank you. Where do I start? I think there is a lot actually. I would. When I would say I agree with you, though my conclusions would be different. I actually, in the written version of the paper, I have a footnote where I briefly address the big alpha that I haven't really done in my talk, except chapter 1 and 2. And where you see a reflection and let's call it meta commentary on what he is doing, I see, oh, actually alpha Elaton must come before this because he relies on these results. So I would basically turn it around and say, yeah, for the reasons you have outlined, because as you say, it can hardly come afterwards. So it's not sort of giving us really new information. I mean, that they are not infinite is new information, but it seems that, so now the four causes, what physics is about and so on, that seems to be very much established in the big alpha. Here, it's not yet really established. Also the four causes, I mean, in alpha Elaton 2, they have a very wide application. I mean, there are examples from here and there. So I see this as a more, let's say, general enterprise. And then physics 2 and 3, narrowing it down to the physics. So in that sense, I would say the physics he's relying on include this stuff in the big alpha. Now, what's the more convincing argument? Well, I guess we both have our, let's say, challenges. I mean, my challenge is, as your first question, that is, how come it's there? While your argument, as you admit, relies on this idea that it might not even be Aristotle speaking, but it's some sort of commentary by someone, someone who has not, has missed a couple of classes, let's say, and now gets some additional points and commentary on that. It's possible. I mean, I'm not saying it's possible, but I like reading between the lines that we would both agree that it's not like, let's say, a straight forward continuation of the argument of book 1. I mean, Owens, and it's taken on by Robertson, say, oh,
no, of course not.
So yeah. So and I think so. We agree on this. Now my hunch would be it's authentic Aristotle, and it's part of material that has come before the metaphysics as a whole. Your conclusion is it's a sort of meta commentary. Yeah, I have to think about this a bit more. But thank you. That's a fascinating suggestion. Thanks.
Thank you.
Fabian?
Oh, yes. If I have time for just some little question about the text, sorry for that. Not the text as to the philological questions, Christian, just about the meaning of akribes or akribologia at quite at the end of the chapter, of the third chapter. My question is, do you mean that Aristotle, in a way, endorses, fully endorses the idea of exactness of or whatever or whichever you choose as translation of akribologia there? As well, for me, Aristotle, mathematics is an exact science for that on that reason. Or does or can that also involve at least a criticism against, for instance, Platonists who go beyond who go beyond the methodological, go beyond and try it. They have tried to for instance, well, to do everything, also physics, as exact as mathematics are. My question is not an either or, out. Perhaps both are possible. That's my question.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad you said both are possible, so I take this option and say both. First, I can't quite remember who said it, but it has been remarked, I think, that akribologia can have a sort of pejorative aspect to it. So I think your suggestion is certainly correct when it comes to this. And I would say that the emphasis in this passage actually is on, I think it was your second point, namely that there is a kind of, let's say, criticism against the Platonic method present. And in my talk, I mentioned Kuhlmann, and he sort of thinks this notion of paideia is really intimately related to a criticism of the academics, as far as I recall, namely that they think there is sort of this universal science, and each science just has the same kind of method. And Aristotle says, no, you can't have like this kind of encompassing theoretical philosophy that explains everything. And it's also a mistake to think the way you conduct mathematics is the same way you approach natural science. So the mathematization of physics is a no-go. So I think this is in this passage at the forefront. That Aristotle says, well, after a general introduction, but beware, each kind of science comes with its own distinctive methods, and you can't expect, and I mean, he does this in the same way in the ethics, so that's a common theme. And the term akribologia, as I said, suggests to me that here it's a kind of criticism that people expect a certain accuracy of physics that is just not given, and it's even detrimental, and is sort of completely on the wrong track. However, said that, I think, I mean, this is also part of the reason why I think this idea that Aristotle had not properly distinguished between physics and metaphysics and other sciences does not float, because this passage speaks against it. However, I do think that Aristotle thinks that mathematics has this accuracy, and I also think that presumably metaphysics has it. So it certainly is not saying that this is generally not to be had, but it's saying it's not to be had in physics. But thank you. Yeah.
Christian, thanks a lot. I have just a couple of points, small points. One is,
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you whether it is essential for your view that the last sentence of alpha minor 3 should be deleted, because I mean that sentence appears in all manuscripts, right? Yeah. The one that says that, and then we will see if it is proper of just one science or of many to study the causes and the principles, right?
Yeah.
And just, I mean, by what you put in your handout, it seems that you want to delete it, but
yes,
I think that I mean, whether this is good or not, I mean, I think that it shouldn't be deleted, but that's a different question. The question is that the problem that the sentence caused a problem to your interpretation, right?
No.
I think no, because I'm thinking, because I mean, let me say what it causes a problem. I mean, if we don't delete it, it causes a problem, because you're presupposing as an interpretation of alpha minor 2. I think you said that Aristotle is assuming there that the study of the causes is not particular of physics, because then we can only see alpha minor 2 as some sort of general methodological claim about theoretical sciences and not something specific about physics, right? But then if he's presupposing that, then making the last question is in conflict with that presupposition, right? Because I mean, he's asking again what he presupposed in alpha 2, a minor 2, according to your views. So I think that it was essential for your view to delete the last sentence.
Yeah. It's I mean, so it might be a problem. So the reason why I deleted is that the exact same formulation is turns up in beta 1. And I think it's plausible that someone has added it to smooth the transition to beta. So I think this is a interpolation by someone, by an editor. However, if you say, well, I want to have the text as it is, There is a way to make it compatible with my reading, and that would be my Deuteros Plus. Namely, the point would then not be to say whether it's the task of one or several sciences to investigate the principle and causes of all things, but it would be restricted to all natural things. And that's a question that actually comes up in physics 2 as well. So in physics 2.2, there is the puzzle. Well, the natural scientist, is the natural scientist study only matter? Does it also study form? Both? In what sense? And this would be sort of the that was actually, reading it in this way was suggested by Janone. So I would take up this suggestion, and would connect it with this question in physics 2.2, where Aristotle seems to be keen on showing that it is actually the task of the physicist to know both about form and matter. So again, this would sort of fit my general line of, we first show that the four causes are not infinite, and now we still have to establish that the four causes are actually applicable to natural beings. Because it might be that some of these causes of natural beings are not applicable, but fall in the purvey of the natural scientist. Maybe some causes of the natural beings are dealt with by the mathematician, the metaphysician, whoever else, and he would be showing that the physicist, qua physicist, has to know all of them. So this is how I would then try to connect it if we kept the sentence. Given that sort of exactly the same phrase occurs in beta, I'm still more on the some interpolation, some addition side, but that would be my alternative explanation.
Oh, okay. Thanks a lot. That's fair enough. And just to end up the discussion, so why is this not a part of physics? I mean, why don't we have alpha minor as part of physics, or the physics, right, of the treatise?
Yeah.
Because I mean, you say it's introduction to physics, right? You suggested that perhaps it was something that Aristotle wrote at some point, and then he discarded in order to write Physics Book 1 or something like that. Yeah, I know you have an explanation of that, especially because I mean, there are some similarities between Physics 1.1 and Alpha Minor 1, right? Because I mean, there's the talk about what is better known by nature and better known to us. That same topic recurs in Physics 1.1, and also, although it's dealt with differently, but this idea of hitting the whole but not the parts, or grasping the whole but not the parts, comes up in both texts, right? I mean, in Alpha Minor 1 and Physics 1.1, right? Also in different terms and several other things. So I don't know if you have some sort of explanation of these or not.
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the start, so I'm taking over. This is a hypothesis I didn't come up with myself, but I took it over from others. But yeah, I mean, if we look at the physics, you might think that sort of physics 2 might have been some sort of single treatise on nature, and Alpha Elaton might just have been its introduction. And then for whatever reason, Physics 1 replaced it, and now it had no home, so it went where it is now. It's of course, it requires a lot more than this, but this is sort of roughly the outline. What you said about Physics Alpha 1 and Metaphysics Alpha Elaton 1, I completely agree. And I mean, I mentioned this. I mean, I think this is actually a good example that what's distinctive about the introduction to Alpha Elaton 1 is just that it is so long. but that he mentions these sort of very general features, knowing the whole but not the part, what's better known by nature, what's better known to us. It's exactly the same material you also find in physics 1. But there no one would say, oh, wait a second, can this really be an introduction to physics? Shouldn't it be somewhere else? So, so I think it's just a matter of length as opposed to content. And I mean, you might, if you want to be really speculative, you might even think, well, maybe he took over some of the very same material and attached it now in a very short version onto the physics alpha. Because as I said, I find the similarities striking, and especially sort of this, I mean, the whole part thing, which seems to be common to precisely these 2 passages. But I would not want to bet my house on it. Let's put it. Not that I have a house, but if I had a house, I wouldn't bet my house on it. Yeah, but this is so I would completely agree on the parallels of the first chapter.
Okay, thanks a lot, Christian. I mean, it was really interesting and thought-provoking, and I would like to thank you for your talk and everyone for joining in the discussion. So I hope we have the opportunity to meet again. And so thanks everyone. Thanks, Christian.
Yeah. Thank you so much again for the invitation, and thank everyone for your question. That's really helpful. And I have a long list of things I have to address. That was super helpful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.